Okay, tonight we missed class because of the weather, and I did promise that there would be a live video covering Chapter 8, which is what we did, we're required to start on tonight. I won't probably cover everything in the chapter, and since there isn't a chance for question and answer, I'll open that up on Wednesday night, and also we'll lecture over Chapter 9 that night. So one thing that I do want to go over before we get started into Chapter 8 is that I haven't really gone over the final project topic there, the document that's in D2L, and I wanted to go over that, and I have made some changes to it, which I posted into D2L at this time, what should already be completed. And actually, since I have not covered that in detail, and I told you all just to write a paragraph, I do want to add to that what is actually in your final project and what I will expect to be in that folder in the next week or so. I won't expect it by Thursday because I have not really gone over it until now. But one thing that we haven't talked a lot about, because in this textbook, we're just basically trying to learn the HTML and now the presentation code, which is done in CSS. But I need to go over some of the planning of your website, your final project, and this is one of the most important things that you do, because I can't tell if you can really apply the things we've learned in this class, which so far we're just following the exercises and building a site. But I want you to put some planning into your site, and we don't cover that in this textbook. My other textbook we did, so it's still very important that you have a purpose. So if you look down towards the bottom of the final project that I'm bringing up here, it tells you the things that your website project will be evaluated on, the following criteria. And I'm going to be bringing up some of these things on the next time we meet. I'll let you know if that's going to be on Wednesday that I'll bring these up. But the accomplishment of the project objectives, which we're going to talk about that here in this next section, contains the required elements, which were listed up above, that it's visually appealing, and that it is making application of design principles. And I'll be going over those at a later time, the design principles. And those are things that you can also look up in website design, how important it is. But in your narrative, which is also in the final project called Website Topic Approval, and I've copied this portion, extracted it from here and copied it in Evernote and also in a news item, so that you can make sure in your narrative. I did not bring this out in class when several of you came up to me. I had forgotten that these basic things we had not covered in this class since I'm using this different book. So I want to be sure that you, when you talk about your website and discuss it, what you plan on doing, I want you to answer these questions in your paragraph. You can either state the question and answer it that way in complete sentence, or you can answer it in complete sentences in a paragraph. But I want you to be sure that you've thought about these things, and also that you've found a couple of sites that are similar to what you want to do, and explain why you did choose them. So this is something that you can't just jot down in a few seconds. I expect you to spend some time, because why waste time building a website if it's not going to accomplish anything? So other than meet the requirement for this class. And then the second document that you will put in, you'll have two documents in your folder. One is the website topic approval. The other one is a planning analysis sheet. And on this one, some of the things that you skimmed over in your narrative will be in more detail here. What's the goal of your website? So how is that different from what is the purpose of the site? Well, here I want you to really, because these first two things say, what do you want the website to accomplish and what's the purpose? Well, these will be similar to what these are, but this will be the stated goal. Describe the goal of your website in 1 or 2 sentences. What results do I want to see? List the working title of each page on your web. You will have 7 to 11 working titles listed. Remember, I said 6 to 10 pages, so it will just depend on what. That's all I'm wanting here is a list of all the titles of your web page. Does that mean they can't change? No, not at all. This is just kind of a rough draft. So what information do I need? List where you will obtain the content. Where are you going to get, if there's facts, where are you going to get the text? Where are you going to get the graphics? If you're going to put any sounds on, where are you going to get those? Where's the video? And this is just kind of a rough draft. That doesn't mean you're going to stick to that. I just want to see that you've started planning for this. How will your project use a form? Because that is one of the requirements. Even if you don't know what a form is, you've all used one on a website. So just start thinking about which page, and that would be a page that, are you going to use it for feedback for a certain thing? You're going to use it for a survey? You're going to post a subscription to a newsletter? What are you going to use the form for? So those 2 documents are the 2 things that I want by next week, the week of February 23rd. I would like for you by that Wednesday, which would be what, 26th, to have those 2 documents into your folder, because we're getting down to the last couple weeks after that. This is the 5th week. So at the end of this week, we'll only have 2 weeks of class left. So I want to be sure that you've done that and notify me, and I'll take a look at them. Okay, so if you have questions about what I just went over, we'll give some time for that in Wednesday's class. So now I want to go ahead and quickly get on into Chapter 8. So Chapter 8 is actually going to talk to us about how to create CSS styles with fonts and colors. And it's a fairly long chapter, but it's not real difficult if you went through and did the things and brought out, read through there and did the exercises as you went along. So if you don't have this done before you come to class on Wednesday, please get this Chapter 8 completed. It's really where we've been talking a lot about. We already used font family in a previous chapter, but text and fonts from 30,000 feet. What they're meaning there is that it's dedicated to helping you style your text. Using CSS, you can control font, style, color, and even the decorations that are put on your text. And that's what's going to be covered in this chapter. And you remember that I did talk a little bit about text decoration, which is where the underline comes in a hypertext link. And you can tell with the CSS style rule, you can say text decoration none. But right here, we're going to be talking about a font family. And when you're going to see in this chapter how, when you define, like for the body of font family, then that's sort of like the default. And then you can go in by specific selectors and determine if you want the font to be different. But these are the most common ones that are used and can be used without worrying about it being on specific computers. And what you'll see happens here a little later on in the next page or so, it breaks that statement down. You can add color to text with the color property, and I did talk about this before too, that it doesn't say text color. It just says means that it's going to affect the text. Then we have font weight, which is how we tell whether it's bold or not. And you do that with CSS instead of that B tag that we've seen used. Here's text decoration. You can have underline, you can have none, overline, line through. So these are just a few of the properties. So what is a font family anyway? Well, that's what we see here are the different, and we talked about a little bit about sans serif last week. Then we have serif, sans serif, and then the ones that you might not be as familiar with, monospace means that every letter takes up the same amount of space. So if it's an M, it's the same amount of space as an O or an N. So that's what mono means, single. It's just one. Cursive is some of your more font families that are ones that you are more fun, like the fantasy ones. A lot of these you have to be careful because they might not be on certain computers, so you have to know how important that is to you. Okay, then our font magnets, where you go in and make sure you understand those. I'm going to go on past this, but be sure that you go in on each one of these pages that it says Dusting Off Tony's Journal, and it tells you what they're going to do here. Well, then be sure that you go into that file when it tells you here, it says first create a new file, journal.css. So this is on page 319. So you need to do that and add that CSS to add that rule to a CSS file. And so just continue on. If you have questions, you can ask those on Wednesday. But down here on the not too dumb questions, I do want to make that a little larger so we can see it here. I do want you to be sure you read through these and see if you have any questions. But one of the first ones says, how do I specify a font with multiple words in the name like Courier New? This is important right here when you're using your style rule for font family. If the font like Times New Roman, Courier New have more than one word, you have to put them in quotes. Otherwise, if it's just a single word font, then that's not required. And then over here, read all the questions, but then the last question says, how do I know which to use, serif or sans serif? Well, that's always a question every student has, and there really are no rules. But in computers, they found that many people consider sans serif the best for body text, which would be like Arial, Verdana, Helvetica. Those are sans serif, which sans means not serif or no tails. But actually, you'll see now people mixing all kinds of fonts. Use 2 Times New Roman, Courier. Those were found in text or published documents. So this is where the next page is where it breaks down. Now, these are important to know. These fonts are likely to be found in both Windows and Macintosh. These are likely to only be found on Macintosh. Now, this is the breakdown of the font family statement and the order in which it is going to search on that in that browser for those fonts. Now, the next thing is pretty interesting. What if there's fonts there that you found out on the web and not sure if it's going to be on there on that browser. You can use a new CSS rule called @FontFaceRule, but this rule has to go above any of the body or any rules that pertain to the body. but this and these fonts have to be included on the server in a or they have to be linked to a source, and it shows you how to do that here. Let's see, where is it? That's over on this one, how to add the web font. And if there's any of this that you don't understand, but then we can talk about it on Wednesday. But be sure you go through and put it in correctly into the page, because what they've done is they've included these couple of fonts, and they've linked the source here. And so here they tell you, above the body rule, put this at font face rule in the journal.css file. So you should put it in just like this, which should cause any place that the font family emblema 1 sans serif, that means that it's going to load at the at font face. It's going to load that font, and then it can will actually use it then on your page. But be sure to do a test drive like it says here with the web font. Now there are a couple of things here also in the There Are No Dumb Questions on page 327. I want to be sure that you go through and look at, there are other built-in CSS rules. That's what tells us right here. And before there was an at font face, there was also an at import, and you see that it allows you to import other CSS files rather than link them, and that puts them right in your document. Then there's an at media, which is new in HTML5, which allows you to create CSS rules that are specific to certain media types. Like, the reason this is so important is because we load web pages on how many different sizes of devices, and so we can actually tell it with an at media if it's going to be a desktop screen, a mobile screen, a print screen, if we want it to be something that we print out. So that's what the at media does. And then the web fonts seem great. Are there any disadvantages? Well, the disadvantages are that it's sometimes a pain to manage font files. Finally, you may find mobile and small devices that don't support them. So you want to be sure to allow alternatives in your design. And that's what the next one is good to look at too. And then over on the last dumb question over here, it tells you a website to go to if you want to look up hosting of other web fonts. And there's a Google one too. Google Web Font Service, google.com web fonts, is a way you can let Google do all this hard work for managing the fonts and the CSS for you. So in this case, you just link to the font you want on the Google service and then use the names in your CSS. So that's really something to look into. Now, font sizes. There's always a lot of questions about, because there are 3 ways that you can designate the size of your font. And you need to go in and look at these, make sure you understand that % and M kind of do the same thing, but most people fall back because they understand percentages better. A 14 pixel or the PX makes it that absolute size and won't allow it to change size depending upon what you want the size to be. And then keywords, you can actually use words like this to define the default, and that's a good thing to start with. And if you look there on page 330 at the bottom, it gives you what ways and why to specify your font size. It says to choose a keyword, which would be something like small, medium, for your default. And then whenever you want to change sizes of your font, if the rest of them have been done with either M or percentages of the default, then if you go in and change it to medium, then all the font sizes will adjust accordingly. So that's a really good way to define your fonts. Also, the older versions do not support text scaling when you specify the font size using pixels, so you want to be careful there. But here's an example of one way to do it. So on your website, you would want to determine how important that is, and hopefully your site, you can go out and find some that you like. Let's make these changes. So here it has you go in and make those changes and then test drive it. So be sure you're doing that along the way. And there's one thing here that I want to bring out. There's a lot of things in here that are important but because of the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of it in the lecture. What's the difference between M and %? They seem like the same thing, and this is what it covered just in the previous pages, but people still sometimes have trouble with it. But they both give you a way to size relative. So you remember, just like in absolute and relative links, this is relative to whatever the default is, and that's what both of those do. It's just some people find it a lot easier to find a percentage than to think about an M. Okay, and one thing else that I wanted to bring out is down here at the bottom, it talks about 90% of a font size, and it says that the default font size, which we just said, is usually 16 pixels. So 90% would be about 14 pixels. So if you were specifying a rule that was 90% of the default, that's what it would be. And then you also have the option of changing the font's weight, which we talked about earlier. And then you test drive it with the normal weights. You can add style, italic, oblique. There's different ones that you can use. Here's a way to do a block quote with font style italic instead of putting quote marks. This is the better way to do that. Okay, so the last thing is being able to specify colors. And what you want to remember here is that the colors, web colors are specified in terms of how much red, green, and blue make up the color. You specify the amount of each color from 0 to 100% and then add them all together to arrive at a final color. Notice that on a computer screen, mixing together colors results in a lighter color. After all, this is light that we're mixing. And that's what you see here, and that they're showing you there in the middle. But if you add, say, only 60% of each component, then what would you expect? Less white. And so when you take those colors down on the computer screen, you're going to get to black if there's none on there at all. So here's the ways that we can specify colors. Be sure you go over this. These are just using the word. I'd never do it that way because sometimes it will not mean the same thing on different browsers. Hardly anybody uses the RGB. I'm not really sure why, but they don't. Most people use the hex codes. And so I really like the way they explain it in this book, because in Fundamentals of Programming Logic, we talk about it a little bit. But here it's pretty unique how they use 10 fingers and show you how hexadecimal actually means 16. So you'd only use single digits all the way, and you start with letters. So when you see this in a color, you can separate it, and it even tells you how to convert it to its equivalent RGB. So here it has you to find colors, you can do this either with Photoshop, Photoshop Elements, or you can just go to this website here and you can find this chart that will give you the hex codes. Okay. Talks about the shorthand way to do the hex codes also in one of these question and answers. That's down here. So be sure you understand that. And then the last thing is they talk about the text decorations, which we've talked a little bit about. Just be sure you go through and put all these into the CSS file. Now remember, this is in a file called journal.css, which is not an HTML file. It's a simple text file. And that will be my conclusion. And if you have any questions, we'll talk about that on Wednesday. But here in Evernote, I've told you to watch this video, complete the CSS additions to Tony's journal, and then this is where I've just copied into Evernote also the extract from the final project that's to be done this week. And be sure you've read Chapter 9 before class on Wednesday, and hope to see you then. Have a nice evening.